Henry VIII was once Europe's golden prince, tall, gifted, and skilled in music, sport, and diplomacy. 4 decades later, he ended his reign in pain from illness, amid rumors of mental decline, what transformed a Renaissance icon into a harsh, isolated monarch. Let's follow medical clues and the historical record to separate fact from myth. The Golden Prince. In 1509, Henry VIII ascended the throne at just 17, a true Renaissance model, tall, fond of jousting, hunting, fencing, and tennis, and an accomplished archer. He also loved music and courtly literature. Educated in the new humanist spirit, Henry read and wrote Latin and French, and debated fluently with European envoys. The early years of his rule bore the stamp of ceremony and diplomacy, with a king who prized both science and the arts and wanted England to stand alongside the great continental powers. That reputation was reinforced by his image as a cultural patron. Court compositions were often associated with his name, and later a religious title was bestowed on the monarch. Together, these formed the portrait of the Golden Prince, vigorous, refined, and confident in shaping a new order. But history rarely preserves its first glow. From that height, what made Henry's image grow heavier with power, harsher in decision-making, and ultimately fade under illness? We'll trace the milestones to see how that image changed toward the end of his life. The fateful fall of 1536. The 24th of January, 1536. Greenwich. On the palace tiltyard, Henry VIII, about 44 years old, rode out in heavy armor before thousands of expectant eyes. The trumpets sounded, the horses charged, lances lowered, and then a violent collision. The king was thrown. Contemporary accounts say he was unconscious for several hours. In the heavy silence of the stands, a larger question emerged. After this fall, what would change? Through the lens of modern medicine, many researchers have proposed a traumatic brain injury, especially to the frontal lobes, the brain region tied to impulse control, planning, emotional regulation, and empathy. Damage there doesn't turn someone into a different person overnight, but it can amplify existing traits, resolve into impulsiveness, caution into suspicion, calm into irritability. After 1536, sources begin to describe a Henry who was more erratic, more suspicious, and at times made hard decisions at a pace that kept courtiers on edge. This was also when major political upheavals occurred, and Boleyn, the second wife, was arrested and executed just months after the accident. Thomas Cromwell, the architect of reform, was also executed in the following years. We do not assert a direct causal link between the fall and these sentences. History is rarely so linear. But the timing is clear, suggesting the king's health and psychology may have become a political variable in the late reign. From 1536 onward, Henry's physical problems also mounted. Persistent pain, reduced activity, and uncomfortable swelling meant he rarely returned to the lists, a symbolic change, since the Joust had once been the stage for royal power and masculinity. From the image of a golden prince thundering on horseback, Henry entered an era of ruling in pain, where every decision was both political and shaped by the body. Since 1536, the record shows Henry grew more erratic, more suspicious, and quicker to use political force. And as the body began to resist the king, the entire court had to learn to read his mood from expression to tone of voice. That is the necessary backdrop for understanding Henry VIII's final years, when power, pain, and legend intertwined to create a chapter both brilliant and dark. Leg, ulcers, and chronic illness. After the 1536 fall, an old problem returned to plague Henry, a leg ulcer that relapsed and lingered. Tudor medicine had bandages, herbal salves, and warm compresses, but with a wound that was frequently irritated. The risk of chronic infection was very high. Pain reduced the king's activity, and as he hunted and trained less, his weight began to rise rapidly. Picture the negative loop: pain to less activity, to weight gain, to more pressure on the wound, to worse pain. At the same time, chronic infection isn't just about the leg. When the body is constantly fighting inflammation, patients can experience persistent fatigue, low mood, poor sleep, and difficulty concentrating, all of which affect temperament and decision quality. This didn't turn Henry into someone else, but it made his days of rule heavier and shorter-tempered. By the 1542nd, the physical traces point to serious decline in strength. Parts of the palace needed wider doors, some wooden floors were reinforced, and special chairs and wheel seating with removable arms were prepared. Public ceremonies were pared back, and movement inside the palace relied heavily on attendant support. For a king who had once been the court's athletic icon, this was symbolic. Power now had to pass through the pain of the body. Chronic infection wears down strength and worsens mood, and a king's mood always leaves its mark on politics. We need to keep this context in mind when looking at Henry's late decisions. It's both the history of power and the story of a body fighting pain every day. The final decline. 1546-1547, Henry VIII's health declined sharply. Edema, chronic pain, insomnia, and prolonged exhaustion meant the king rarely appeared in public. The pace of governance shifted toward councils and advisors. The piles of petitions grew, and major decisions were often discussed collectively before being presented for the king's approval. In that setting, Henry still tried to guide policy, but his body had become the limit. Court rituals were shortened, audiences grew briefer, and courtiers learned to schedule business around the king's sick rhythm. January 1547. Grim news spread within the palace. Henry had visibly weakened. Archbishop Thomas Cranmer was summoned to the sickbed. There, official sources described a solemn religious rite, final prayers, and a monarch who had battled illness for years, passing within the bounds of faith. The more sensational details about his last moments generally appear later in the tradition and should be treated as legend, unless confirmed by solid evidence. What is certain is that by the end, chronic pain and physical depletion shaped how Henry ruled much, went through council, and the final moment was wrapped in religious ceremony rather than lurid spectacle. From Golden Prince to a weary king on his sickbed, that journey is not only a story of power, but also a story of human limits. After Henry's death, many dramatic tales arose from funeral rites to the condition of the body. This channel will sort what comes from official chronicles and ambassadorial letters and compare them with later accounts that often amplify events for effect. The firm conclusion: Henry died after a prolonged decline from illness. Sensational details should be treated as legend unless backed by strong evidence. Henry VIII left a complex legacy. He helped shape the Tudor state and stood as a symbol of hard power. If the 1536 fall had never happened, would England and even Europe have taken a different path?